Academica Media. From Academica Media Studios in Miami, Florida, it's Big Ideas in Education, a weekly recap of inspiration and innovation in your schools.
Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm Ryan Kairalla. Joining us on the program this week is Dr. Sydney Schaef, the Managing Director of the Education Design Consultancy, reDesign. Recently, reDesign announced its Future9 Competencies for educators and system leaders to empower these individuals to effectively navigate competency-based education. You can check out reDesign's downloadable framework on their website, www.redesignu.org/future9. Sydney, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Ryan. It's great to be here.
It is great to be chatting with you. This is another one of those topics that when I see it come up on my lists of guests to interview, I immediately get pretty excited about it because I think this is a really cool field. I think competency-based education makes a lot of sense, and it produces some pretty cool outcomes in the data that I've seen. So get us up to speed if you could. Before we get into the Future9 competencies, can you tell us generally about what competency-based education is and why it's important?
Oh, thanks for that question. If I had to boil it down to one word or idea, for me, it's really about an apprenticeship model for learning. There's a meaningful outcome we're working toward. There's a mentor expert that's providing personalized support. And there's a journey of developing skills, strategies, techniques, knowledge that help the learner over time move on that journey from novice to expert. And applied in at a systems level, which is what makes it so complex, it means a few things. It means that our learning system requires a level of flexibility and responsiveness to allow learners to advance when ready, when they've demonstrated readiness, rather than a time-based system, which is our current model. So that's in a nutshell, I would say, kind of some key features of a competency-based learning approach.
It definitely lends more to a individualized, self-paced education for the learner, which I think is inherently important. And to me, it also, when I think of competency-based educations, I see a lot of parallels between that and another form of education that I'm pretty fond of, which is project-based learning. And
Yes.
they both kind of lend to this learning by doing, building mastery by actually becoming an expert in something, as opposed to just sort of learning things for the sake of, learning abstract concepts, which I don't discount. But when we can actually attach goals to it, we can attach expertise and competence to learning, I think we produce better outcomes.
I couldn't agree more. And I appreciate the connection to project-based learning. One signature of competency-based ed, as is true in apprenticeship, right? You're working in authentic things that matter and have meaning and importance to you and in the world. And I think project-based learning is a really great, expression of authentic work that really, we at reDesign, we like to emphasize this idea of learning as a creative process, right? Bloom's, that's the highest level of learning, and that we can design learning experiences that don't just culminate in, a test score, but something that has meaning in the world.
Oh, meaningful education through competency-based education. I found a kindred spirit here, viewers and listeners. This is pretty exciting. And the way that you have carried this ball forward is through your organization's creation of these Future9 Competencies, which you've built to sort of be this framework to allow educators and system leaders alike to more effectively navigate competency-based education, to boost it in their respective institutions. So can you give us an overview? How do these Future9 competencies further competency-based education?
Thanks for that question, Ryan. The Future9 competencies are a free and open source framework that define 9 essential skill sets for future readiness. They were really born out of the question, what are the most important skill sets that lead to agency and well-being in life, work, learning, and community? And while there are many frameworks out there, I think there are a few things that make this particular framework stand out, which we just released a few months ago. The first is that it offers a sort of very clear definitive approach to defining and measuring future readiness. So, when some of our core academic standard frameworks emerged 15 years ago or so, a lot of the talk was about college readiness. And more recently, we're hearing the field speaking more intentionally about future readiness more broadly, college as one possibility. But beyond that, we live in a very complex, rapidly changing world. What does it mean to prepare young people for that adequately? So this framework not only offers a definition for the skills that are most important to future readiness, it also offers a way to measure progress toward that vision. The second thing that I would say makes it stand out is that, reDesign's core work, actually, since our founding about 15 years ago, has been working very closely in partnership with schools, districts, and state departments to help make schools and school systems work better for young people. And a lot of our work has focused on competency-based learning, not as the end that we're aiming for, but as the means by which we get to more learner-centered and effective models of schooling. We were able, through a very generous grant that we received a few years ago, to kind of draw on the learning over a decade of building these kinds of competency frameworks, using them in practice with educators, gathering feedback from users, iterating on those designs, coming back to the latest research on, cognition, social emotional learning, future readiness. And with this generous grant, we're able to kind of synthesize all of that learning in partnership and in our own research process, and sort of distill those into this Future9 competency framework that we were so thrilled to release. And then before we put it out into the world, I'll just share one other thing, which is we engaged industry leaders, academics, researchers with expertise on these areas of competency and said, will you look at this? Will you pressure test this? Will you give us some real deal critical feedback that we then integrated before we released it? So there've been a lot of hands on this work. And again, it's an open resource to the field for anyone who's interested in, a spark of inspiration on how to define competencies, or a framework they'd like to get, adopt or adapt for their system without the really intensive work of building one from scratch.
Now, I would like to very much hear some examples from you about how these Future9 competencies have been used in action, either at the classroom level or at the system level. But before we get to that, I want to ask you more about something that I know I can already hear like the teachers and administrators saying, which is, oh gosh, not another set of standards. I mean, we already have so many standards to comply with. We have state mandated standards. We can't just throw out what we have and replace it with the Future9 competencies, no matter how good they are. But my understanding is that you develop these competencies not to replace existing standards, but actually to work around and within existing standards and just infuse them with more competency-based education. Do I have that right?
You do have that right. There are really three ways that the Future9 can work together with standards, current academic standards. One is to sort of amplify, dial up the most important transferable skills that are already existing in standards, but that are kind of siloed by subject area. We'll take the example of inquiry. Inquiry is happening in lots of subject area contexts. It's a really important skill for learning now, for learning in the future, for life, etc. Competencies help kind of elevate what is quality inquiry, what are the skills of inquiry, and how do you develop them? So we help teachers in their practice sort of prioritize the most important transferable skill sets in a more user-friendly format. The second way I think Future9 can be supportive, we hear a lot of educators say, my learners are not just, or my students are not just developing academic skills and knowledge. They're whole humans who have all, aspects of their life that are important, that impact how they show up in their learning environment, how they interact with others socially, how they understand themselves and their emotional learning. The Future9 attend to the whole child and sort of fill in the gaps of those social skills and emotional skills that you don't see explicitly stated in the standards, but we know are really important for learning. And third, I mentioned a more user-friendly format. Standards are organized by grades, grade levels, and sort of this idea of time-based advancement. The competency framework takes the sort of core whole child and academic learning skills, and instead of organizing them by time-based, grade levels, we've built developmental progressions that you can use for framing learning targets, designing assessments, giving students feedback, measuring growth using stable, common language. So there's a user friendliness to them that kind of makes the things you're already expected to do in standards much more user friendly. We've seen teachers say, you know what, I'm looking at this framework and I see language right now I can use to build a better rubric, for example. So there's lots of exciting applications, but the idea is let's lighten the design load.
Yeah.
Let's elevate what matters most to building agency for learners, and let's fill in the gaps where standards aren't really attending to some of those really important aspects of youth development.
Well, I would imagine that lightening the load is going to be music to the ears of a lot of educators looking for ways to find efficiencies in their lesson planning while still empowering their students. I want to get back to something you mentioned earlier about the emphasis that the Future9 competencies place on basically advancing the whole child, right? Not just allowing a student to learn more, but to kind of just making them the best versions of themselves as human beings over time, which is, I think, is a critical component of competency-based learning. And I see that in the text of just how you've written some of these competencies. I look at, for example, the one where you write that one of the Future9 competencies is, I can identify challenges in the world around me and design ways to address them. I mean, talk about giving learning a sense of purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, this isn't just about passing a test, as you mentioned. It's about becoming the best versions of yourself so that you can make the world around you a better place to, you know, to not just like maximize your own potential, but to use that maximized potential to, you know, achieve kind of the highest plane of self-actualization by making the world around you a better place and solving problems. I'm curious, you know, that let's take that particular competency. Have you seen any examples on the ground of how that's been used either at the classroom level or the system level?
Sure. This is an example of human-centered design. We've taken, again, a transferable process. We didn't make it up. There are lots of folks in the world using the sort of skills and methods and strategies of human-centered design to make improvements in their learning. I'll point to a particular context. For the last couple of years, we've had the honor of working with the State Department in South Carolina, and they've taken a really exciting approach. We were their partner in developing their competency framework for their profile of a South Carolina graduate. And then they put some resources behind implementation by supporting opt-in early adopter networks. So we've been working with teachers in a school network across this, the state of South Carolina to try on implementing these competencies. We don't prescribe that teachers start in one particular place like Design Solutions. We encourage them to choose an authentic, a competency that already authentically connects to what they're doing in their classrooms. But yes, Ryan, these competencies then help teachers see sort of what are the core skills to focus on as I'm teaching this process to learners, and then how can I meet learners where they are in that progression. And so using the language of the progression to engage in modeling of what these skills look like, designing learning experiences that really help young people to practice and try on the skills and to do authentic work related to them. In this pilot, I kind of had to do a double take when I saw some of the data roll in. We weren't sure what we'd find, but we saw shifts in some of these core areas of learner efficacy, engagement, culture. For example, students said, you know, in this class, I feel more independent than in others, or I feel challenged, but in a good way. Or, you know, teachers said, or another student example, I know in this class, I'm not alone. If I don't understand something, I can be myself in this class. And teachers talked about, I'll share some quick numbers. 96% of teachers who were part of this pilot said using these competencies helps learners do more rigorous work, more higher order thinking, and contributes to a growth mindset. They're getting to see visible evidence of their growth along the progression. 88% said it improves clarity for learners in the learning process. 100% reported of a 35 teacher sample size. This provides a structure to help students self-assess, reflect, set learning goals, and have a more personalized learning pathway. So we saw some really exciting things happen in implementing these competencies in practice around teacher shifts in practice, shifts in students' mindset around what they can do in their learning or on efficacy, but also the focus being less on grades, we were hearing,
Yeah.
and more on the learning itself.
I mean, it sounds like you're switching the motivation from something external, like passing a test or getting good grades, to something internal, right? The idea of just self-improvement, of becoming an expert in something, and how that is inherently motivating. You don't need that external source of motivation, because whenever we get better at something and we sense it, it's motivating and we want to learn more and we want to keep improving. I mean, it's the reason why for a lot of kids, video games are so darn addictive, because it provides that constant internal motivation, that sense of progression that's baked into the bread of something like competency-based education. That's really, really fantastic stuff.
Thank you.
Let me take a step back, though. For the teachers out there who are perhaps just hearing of competency-based education for the first time, or maybe heard a little bit about it when they were in a teaching training program but have never really had a chance to fully implement it, what advice would you give to teachers who are just sort of dipping their toe in the water? You know, they like what they've heard during this conversation today and want to know what maybe the first steps are to start maybe sprinkling some competency-based education into a couple of their lesson plans or into their curriculum. Where might they start?
I love that question. Well, a great place to start is to get your hands on the framework itself. You can download that for free. You shared the website earlier. And I would say, first, look for authentic connections to what you're already teaching, or something that is really important to you to teach that you see in the Future9, but you don't have resources to support. Secondly, I would say think of the competency framework, and in particular, the skill progressions, as sort of a go-to reference for either designing your learning experience, designing your assessment, or planning scaffolding to make sure that those more rigorous, meaningful, authentic learning experiences can actually support young people in accessing that through understanding, right, transparency about what the skills are and how they develop, understanding where they are in the journey, providing feedback. So even whether it's at the unit level of saying, I want to build a unit that is about designing a solution or engaging in inquiry, or I want to design a lesson to support learners around the skills of navigating conflict or sustaining wellness, right? You find your entry point that's meaningful to you, grab that language from the skill progressions and just start playing. We've seen people start by, wow, this can help me improve my rubric. Or, wow, I'm noticing I was going to implement this science lab. And when I look at my assessment or my activity or my task through the lens of the engage in inquiry competency, I'm realizing when I read that skill progression about framing a question, I didn't ask learners to make observations about phenomena and come up with their own questions. Now I'm going to back up and build that into the design so that I'm nurturing and teaching and creating opportunities for those really important skills. Those are a few examples, I think, of how you might get started.
That's fabulous. That's a great way for teachers to get started. Our guest this week has been Dr. Sydney Schaef, the managing director of the education design consultancy reDesign, and she's been chatting with us about her organization's new Future9 Competencies for competency-based education that they recently launched. You can find out more about our guest's work by visiting redesignu.org/Future9. Sydney, before we let you go, we got one last question for you. If with the snap of your fingers you could make any change to the education system, what change would it be?
I love this question, Ryan. I know everyone struggles a bit with it. Two things come to mind. If I'm imagining outcomes, it's that every learner gets to experience a deep sense of connectedness, the opportunity to build competency, and the opportunity to experience real agency in their learning. That's how we define learner-centered communities at reDesign. If I'm talking about inputs, though, you know what? If I could snap my fingers, I think there's really something to this idea of recasting the learning outcomes in the K-12 system to be more focused on agency building skills for learning and life. And there are so many parts of the education system that are implicated by that one sort of lever. So I think that's a powerful lever for change. I think that's what I would say. Let's reimagine learning outcomes based on learning sciences and the most important skill sets for future readiness.
No argument here. That sounds terrific. Sydney, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Such a pleasure, Ryan. Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for checking out Big Ideas in Education.
views expressed on the preceding program have been those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Academica, its clients, staff, affiliates, or advertisers.